let's review economic efficiency. So we want to think now about consumer and producer surplus. So we're going to be thinking economic efficiency. And our goal here is to compare perfect competition with monopoly, because those are the two ends of the extreme. And then other markets fall in between those. Let's start by reviewing consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, which I'm typically going to abbreviate CS, consumer surplus, that's just our measure of the well-being of the buyers, the demand side of the market, the people who buy a good. And remember that consumer surplus is equal to willingness to pay minus the price paid. Remember that willingness to pay is how we measure value. The value that you place on something is your willingness to pay to get it, because your willingness to pay represents other goods and services that you're willing to give up to get whatever the good is that we're talking about, or the service. So consumer surplus is how much value you place on the good minus what you have to give up to get it. It's value that's left over that you were willing to part with but didn't have to. So, for example, let's suppose someone values, let's say, a shirt. Values a shirt at $100 and pays $70. Pays $70. So they pay $70 to get it. They were willing to pay $100. We would say that they get consumer surplus equal to $30. That's $30 of value they were willing to give up but didn't have to. They can spend that on something else. It's surplus value. If we're interested in the total amount of surplus, say, in a market, then we would be thinking about, if we have, say, a demand curve. Let's suppose we've got a demand curve, and let's suppose our choke price up here is $200. Let's suppose the price is, say, 70. So here's 70. And let's suppose at that price, there's 1,000 shirts being sold in the market. So suppose we've got a market. I'm leaving off the supply curve that would be right there, but because I want to focus on surplus. So if we wanted to calculate the total amount of consumer surplus over all of these units, then it would be the area under that demand curve and above the price. It would be this area right here, consumer surplus. So that vertical this is a triangle. Total consumer surplus would be this vertical distance, which is 130, times this horizontal distance, which is 1,000. And then we have to divide it by 2 because it's a triangle. That means that there's $130,000 of consumer surplus in that market. Let's review for a second. Why is it that consumer surplus in this case was just one number minus another? And in this case, it's an area. And the difference is that this is consumer surplus that goes to one person for one transaction. And this is the total amount of consumer surplus that's going to multiple people because there's lots of units that are being transacted here. So if we're thinking about this is just one transaction. This would be like if we had a consumer who was willing to pay, let's say a consumer right in here, who's willing to pay 100, but so for that unit is bought by a consumer who has a willingness to pay of 100, but only had to pay 70. That means that that vertical distance right there is the 30. That's where that consumer surplus number comes from. That's that person's willingness to pay at the margin for that unit. it's just one of a whole bunch of units that are transacted. Okay, so this is a willingness to pay for one person. This is for the whole market. That's consumer surplus. We can also think about producer surplus. So producer surplus, which I'm going to abbreviate PS, that's our measure of the well-being of sellers. And producer surplus is just the price minus the cost of production. So if a seller sells something for, say, $70 and it only costs them $20 to produce it, then they get $50 of producer surplus. Producer surplus shows up as the area under the price and above the supply curve. So if we were to, say, have a supply curve, I'm talking about this as the supply curve, though it's an inverse supply curve. I talked about that as a demand curve, though it's the inverse demand curve. That's okay. If we had, say, a price of 70, and let's suppose that our choke price for the supply curve is 10. It's not really a choke price. I guess it would be a supply choke price. The sellers would not sell any if price goes below 10. Quantity supplied would be 0. And let's suppose that at that price of 70, there's 1,000 units that are bought and sold, and we wanted to calculate the total amount of producer surplus in the market. It would be this vertical distance, which is 60, multiplied by this horizontal distance, which is 1,000. We've got to divide by 2, and that gives us $30,000 of producer surplus. Now, we're going to be interested in market efficiency, and when we talk about market efficiency, we're going to be talking about what we call total surplus. Total surplus is just consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So we don't care about weighting one side of the market more heavily than the other side of the market. So we're just going to think about the well-being of both sides, and we're going to give them equal weight. And what we would say is that a market is efficient. A market is efficient if total surplus is maximized. A market is said to be efficient if total surplus is maximized. In other words, if well-being is maximized. If total surplus is not maximized, then that means that there's a Pareto optimal move that we could make that would help at least one person and not hurt anybody. So the idea of Pareto optimality was created by an economist named Vilfredo Pareto. And the idea is simply that if there's a move that you can make that would help at least one person and not hurt anybody, then you cannot make a good argument for not doing it. You should do it because you're going to help at least one person and nobody gets hurt. So if total surplus is maximized, then that means that we could reallocate production or consumption, and we could help at least one person and not hurt anybody. And so we would want to do that. Total surplus shows up as the area under the demand curve and above the supply curve. So if we're talking about putting these two together, down here was producer surplus. It's that area down there. If we put these together, we get demand, we get supply, and right here is total surplus. It's all that area below the demand curve and above the supply curve. And you can see that this right there, that's the quantity that creates the maximum amount of area under the demand curve and above the supply curve. There's no more area under the demand curve and above the supply curve beyond Q. Now, let's talk about a comparison of monopoly and perfect competition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a picture, two pictures. In my left picture, I'm going to put perfect competition, and in my right picture here, I'm going to put monopoly. Let's move this over just a little bit. And so I've got P here, Q, Q. This is perfect competition, and this is monopoly. Let's put our market demand curve here. The market demand curve doesn't depend on whether or not you've got lots of firms or one firm, so I'm going to have the same market demand curve. I'm going to have the market supply curve over here, which I would label S. Over in this picture, I would have the same curve, but I wouldn't label it S, I would simply label it marginal cost. So this allows us to compare easily what's going on in these two pictures. And what we would have in this picture is that this would be the quantity, Q star, and this would be the price, P star. That would be our perfect competition quantity and price. In this picture, we would have the marginal revenue curve, and this would be our quantity. Where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect, that's our quantity for the monopoly, and the price would be up here. So this allows us, there's the monopoly's price. This allows us to easily see the impact that a monopoly has on the market. It's going to restrict quantity below what would happen with perfect competition, and it's going to use its market power to drive price up above what would happen with perfect competition. And if we look at the amount of total surplus in the market, total surplus would be that area with perfect competition, but with monopoly, it would only be this area. We would miss out on that, and we call that the deadweight loss of monopoly. I'm going to abbreviate deadweight loss, DWL. So the deadweight loss is this triangle right in here. The deadweight loss caused by monopoly. It's consumer and producer well-being that just is gone out of the market because we've got a situation where the firm has market power. What we're going to do throughout the rest of the class is we're going to be thinking about different types of markets, and we're going to see that it's going to fall in between these two extremes. And we're going to be thinking about, well, okay, in this type of market, how close are we to perfect competition? Or are we very far away from perfect competition? Are we much closer to monopoly? One final thing that we need to review before we move on is the concept of discounting. You would have seen it in probably multiple other classes, but it's something that's going to be useful to us because we're going to be thinking about firms existing across multiple time periods. So if you're a firm, the firm is not just thinking about today. These pictures, a lot of times, the idea is just at a point in time, what's your right quantity and what's your correct price. But we now need to start thinking about the fact that firms may act strategically across time as well. It might be better to produce less now so that you can produce more in the future, or vice versa. The only way that we can think about making decisions across time is to think about the concept of discounting. So let's just review present value. The present value, if we're thinking about 1 year, let's say, the present value would be equal to the future value divided by 1 plus R. So if we're thinking about getting a dollar amount, say 1 year from now, a future dollar amount, and we want to know what's that future dollar amount worth today, we need to discount it. And the way that we discount it is we divide by 1 plus the interest rate. So for example, this would be the present value of a payment made 1 year in the future. So for example, if we had a $1,000 payment made in 1 year and we had a 4% interest rate, then the present value of getting $1,000 1 year from now, if there's a 4% interest rate, the present value of that is equal to 1,000 divided by 1.04. So we take that and we put it into a decimal. 4% is 0.04. So 1 plus 0.04, that gives us this. That is $961.54. So having $1,000 in 1 year at 4% interest, that's the same as having $961 right now and 54 cents right now. Because if you took this and put it into an account that was earning 4.4% interest, that $961.54 would turn into $1,000 in 1 year. So that's discounting if we're just talking about 1 year, or if we had, say, a payment in 2 years. So if we had, let's say this is 1 year. If we wanted 2 years, then the present value would be equal to the future value plus 1 plus r, divided by 1 plus r, and then you've got to square it. So if we did that $1,000 2 years from now, the present value would be equal to 1,000 divided by 1.04 squared. That would be $924.56. So the present value of a $1,000 payment in 2 years, if the interest rate's 4%, is $924.56. If we did it for in years, a payment in years in the future, the present value is equal to the future value divided by 1 plus r to the nth power. And then one final, let me draw a little area here. One last one is we could think about indefinite payments. A payment made annually indefinitely. Then in that case, the present value, let's suppose you get $1,000 next year and the year after and the year after, indefinitely, the present value of that is just the future value, whatever the payment is, divided by R. So for example, the present value, if you're going to get $1,000 every year indefinitely, the present value of that is $25,000. It's 1,000 divided by 0.04. That's equal to $25,000. That's what the present value of that stream of payments is. So we'll use that in the future as we look at how firms are making decisions. So I'll see you in the next video.